Hello, hello. I think we've just gone live.
Excellent. Welcome, everybody. You can see we've got a few participants already. The number is steadily creeping up. So we'll just let a few more people join. But yeah, welcome to those of you who are here already. Thanks for joining so promptly. Can see in the list of participants that we've got a few familiar faces. So it's great to have you back, and welcome to anyone who hasn't attended one of these sessions before. I know it's quite early for some of you, but there's a question that we wanted to present to you to just kind of get your juices flowing. And we'll come back to the answers to this in a bit. So just put your answers in the chat. While we're waiting for a few more people to join, I'll just give a quick overview of what we're going to be covering off today. So we're going to be focusing in on the topic of engagement, specifically what's important to learners, how we can meet those needs now, and how that might change in the not too distant future. So just to introduce myself, for those of you I haven't met, my name is Will Brown, and I head up the Learning Consultancy team. I know many of you have partnered with our team in the past, but for those of you who haven't, we deliver a range of services into Elucidat customers to support them with their most critical L&D priorities. Joining me today is my colleague, Kirstie Greany.
Oh yeah, great to be here. Thanks for coming, everybody. And yeah, I'm Kirstie Greany, Head of Learning Strategy at Elucidat. And really what that means in terms of where you might see me or what you might get out of it is bringing our learning community together to run events and roundtables and sharing lots of insights and ideas, some of which goes on LinkedIn, but also for any Elucidat customers, you'll see it coming your way through emails as well. Yeah, so really excited for the session. I have just prompted you in the chat. Hopefully you can access that to see if you can answer our question, which is what you're focusing on for this year in terms of what's new or different. I'll just skip back to the question there so you can see it come up. Don't be scared, use the chat. We like to keep it interactive.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Kirsty. So to kick off today's session, we're going to look at some of the key messages that came out of the most recent State of Digital Learning report that we published earlier this year. And you can actually access that via our website. So if you want to kind of dig into that in a little more detail in your own time, please do go to our website and access that. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we found that the core engagement principles aren't actually going anywhere. So I say unsurprisingly because while it feels like we're kind of at the dawning of a new technological era, people, or in this context, I suppose we're talking more about learners, kind of remain fundamentally unchanged. So they want learning that is relevant. And we've got a quote here that speaks to this. So 62% of employees say that relevance is the most important factor in learning. So by that, they mean it's got a clear link to business goals and will enable them to be more successful in relation to these goals in their specific roles. They also want learning that is interactive. So we've got a stat around interactivity, which says that 20% of learners switch off when content lacks interactivity. And when I first read this stat, I was actually a little surprised by that figure of 20%, because I thought that actually feels quite low. But as I thought about it a little bit more, I was kind of reflecting on the fact that we're talking about an absolute here. So they're talking about kind of completely switching off. So that's quite a high proportion of your learners. And then if you think about engagement as being more on a kind of sliding scale, there's probably a real high percentage that are on that sliding scale who are at least disengaged to some extent. So I think that 20% number is kind of, when people are 100% checked out, but there's obviously levels to that engagement as well. So the more you can be doing to increase that interactivity, the more that's going to have a positive impact on engagement, sorry. Then the final piece was around personalization. So we've talked about personalization a lot over the years, and it's as important now as it ever was. And the quote here from the survey is all around how we can, do you mind flicking to the next slide, please, Kirsty? So it's
So,
all around how we can actually personalize to people's specific roles. So here we've got 67% of learners don't feel that their digital learning is personalized to their role. So the question is here, what can be done to make learning less generic and more role or context specific? So drawing really clear connections between the information being presented and each audience segment's performance. So we've got another question here for you to weigh in on, and it's all about kind of what interactivity means when we're doing it effectively to really drive up that engagement. So again, please feel free to add your answers or comments in the chat. And we saw before that statistic around how important interactivity is to engagement levels, with 20% of learners admitting to completely switching off when the content lacked interactivity. But what exactly does effective interaction look like? So I think we'd all agree that the vending machine example that we've got here, which you might have seen on Kirsty's LinkedIn post the other day, this isn't a great example of engaging tech, despite having lots of kind of buttons and lights on it. So some of the answers that you've pulled out are kind of, not just clicking on things. So yeah, absolutely. We don't want to just be clicking through lots of things on a screen with, click and reveal interactions with information behind them. That doesn't mean that something is necessarily interactive.
and the irony of this, Will, just to say, full disclosure, that we're talking about interactivity today and engaging learning, and I had accidentally stopped anyone from being able to use the chat at the very beginning. So I've now enabled that. You have to forgive me. We were making a point. See how difficult it was not to interact, but now you can. So thank you very much.
Very, very clever. Well done. Yeah, I did suddenly see the chat come to life, so I wondered if that might have happened. But yeah, some other great examples in here. So social feedback questions that let you see how other people responded, taking people out of that kind of more isolated experience and into something a bit of a broader context. Having some activity on the pages, but also having people thinking and doing something or kind of reflecting personally on things. I think it's a really, really important point. So you've pulled out some great reflections there, and actually they mirror a lot of what we saw from the State of Digital Learning surveys. So a couple of these that really jump out at me is that piece about thought-provoking. So that's that idea of getting people to actually reflect themselves. So it's not just that passive experience of receiving information, but it's a bit of a kind of two-way street there, encouraging that interactive participation, and also the piece about allowing them time to practice what they're learning. So I think that's probably one of the key pieces of interactivity you can include, especially for kind of skills-based training. So those were some reflections from the State of Digital Learning report about kind of the current state of play and what was reported from kind of learners themselves. But what does it mean to kind of really achieve meaningful interaction within e-learning? So reflection, asking people, how do you feel about this? Or, was that the right thing to do? And these kinds of personal reflections provide a type of interactivity that really deepens the learning experience by tying it back to lived experience as well. Provoking thought, so asking people to guess a surprising statistic, for example, or a shocking fact, or revealing surprising consequences, because these can quite often go against like received wisdom that can permeate all through all different like layers of organization, and then they just become, this is the way we do things. So challenging some of that is really important. Application, which we talked about already, so avoiding those passive experiences and kind of weaving in questions or moments where people can practice things, really getting people to apply what they've learned in an authentic, realistic situation. And if you can simulate that real world experience, you're going to embed those behaviors and the thinking processes behind them far more effectively. And then finally is immersive scenarios. So quite often we talk about storytelling and how that can really, really boost engagement. And that can be done in a number of ways, but creating empathy with characters and then kind of watching them carry out their roles and maybe commenting on that or evaluating their performance. If you can actually create relationships between learners and those characters, it's kind of far more engaging because you actually care about the outcomes a little bit more than just an MCQ that's kind of stripped of all that context. But the bottom line here is that interactivity is about engaging people emotionally, engaging people kind of in a cognitive sense. And like someone pointed out in the chat, it's not just about engaging people's fingers and getting them to click lots of buttons. So those are some reflections on the current state of play. I think, Kirstie, you're going to talk a little bit now about emerging trends.
Yeah, definitely. I think what's really important just to reiterate is those 3 points you just talked about. So relevance, interaction, and personalization are the kind of staples. So they've come up year on year in the State of Digital Learning report. So in a minute, I'll talk about some emerging trends, but that doesn't mean we're then taking away from those. They're additions to what are the staples.
Yes.
Because the chat was turned off at the very beginning, you might not have had a chance to answer this question up front, but so let's give you another chance. So I'm interested to find out this year, as you look ahead, what are you embracing that's new for you in digital learning or different to what you've done before? Are you trying out anything that maybe you've been mentioning in the chat already around interactivity? So really keen to know what you're up to and what you're doing. I saw somebody at the beginning, thanks Vicky, talking about building communities of practice on Docebo, which they haven't done before. So that's fantastic. We'll talk a little bit about bringing in the kind of people side of things back into the mix later on when we talk about blends. Social polling and immersive scenarios, updating refresher courses, pre-tests and other content. Okay, great ways to personalize. More decision points and gamification. Help with AI. I was waiting for someone to mention AI, so that's great that you have, because we're not going to hide away from that today. And trying out more storytelling to increase engagement. Okay, so there's great ways that are coming out for which feel like you're kind of personalizing content a lot, personalizing the learning experience through storytelling and simulations, and also through conversations. So let's talk a little bit about some emerging trends. I don't think you're going to be surprised at these either. So one of the key things, and you'll notice that, by the way, I'm not necessarily going to put AI on this slide, and that is because it is inherent in all of these things, and it's also bigger than all of these things. So it's a bit like trying to talk about the internet in relation to online learning. It's huge and it's prevalent everywhere, or it's going to be. So you won't see AI pop up. But when I talk about personalization turned up, we've already talked about personalization being a staple for effective and engaging learning design. I think really what we're seeing is a kind of emerging trend, particularly provoked by AI, is that this is only going to get maxed out. So we're going to see more adaptive learning. We're going to see personalization used eventually for things like coaching bots, to help you there and then with what you need. But I think we're going to see this trend increasing this year. So even more personalization expected by the learners because of what AI can do and new technologies. So immersive learning is set to rise. So VR, AR, and also kind of approaches to gamification are set to rise this year. We do know that VR hardware is becoming less expensive, so it becomes more available to people. But we also recognise that AR and VR kind of apply to a fairly kind of niche zone in learning. So it's not necessarily going to become the biggest trend, but where it does sit currently in its use is going to grow. So it's great for very immersive scenarios, for things like medical training, power plant tours, soft skill scenarios, onboarding in some cases as well. So there's lots of different uses for it, but that's set to rise. Microlearning just hasn't gone away. So it actually is very much a staple, but it's also set to grow this year. And if you think about microlearning, of which we've spent a lot of time kind of studying over the last couple of months, a lot of the uses are about just-in-time resources. So that increasing demand for short bite-sized content is only going to go up this year. And a kind of return of the blend, but in a slightly more mature way. So obviously during the COVID and the lockdowns, digital first became the kind of primary route for any learning, but we're kind of seeing that mix coming back. I think we're seeing a desire for people-to-people based content, especially with the rise of AI and technology, that people are kind of searching out others. So we're going to see e-learning and other forms of digital learning accompanied by kind of coaching sessions. They could be virtual group discussions, and we'll talk a little bit more about blends in a moment. But it's not like the old school way of doing a blend where it might have been a piece of e-learning and a kind of set workshop. So that's definitely not the modern way to do it. And there's lots of kind of sophisticated ways of bringing the blend back in. So Will, actually, I'm going to ask a question to you, which is, what do these rising or emerging trends tell us about learner needs and expectations? So we're looking at those a minute ago. How do you relate back what we know that learners are crying out to the kind of emerging trends?
Yeah, I think off the back of those emerging trends, there's a couple of things that really popped out for me. The first one was this question of learning in the flow, which I think is a problem that people have been aware of for a long time, you know, as long as I've been in the world of digital learning, and that's kind of how to get things to people while they're doing their jobs rather than taking them away from their jobs in order to do their learning. And micro learnings solve that to a certain extent. The proliferation of personal devices or smartphones that can be used for learning has meant that it's more accessible in more different contexts. But I think we're actually seeing much better application of that principle now, and kind of think of it as like interjection. So it's still a kind of case of on demand, but rather than kind of learners always doing that pull, it's sometimes more of a push. So it can be triggered by a certain event. So, you know, you might be working in a system, say you're working in a system that processes invoices, and you submit an invoice, but there's a field missing. That could be an event that triggers a piece of learning for you. You're not quite familiar with this process, so why don't you kind of brush up on this whole process, or maybe just this particular part? And I think that's really, really interesting about how we can be looking to kind of plug skills gaps in that way moving forward. So kind of genuinely smart recommendations that are triggered by real life events, and then kind of serve up what learners need exactly when they need it. And then I think the other thing kind of linked to that is that more contextual learning. So you talked before about VR and AR, and I think it is that kind of right place, right time, right solution is going to be really, really important. And it's only going to grow as, like you said, the cost of the hardware and also the cost of developing the kind of experiences for VR and AR is going to come down in future. So I think in a lot of domains, we're going to see theory going out the window, or certainly far more than it does now, and the focus being on that really kind of high quality simulated practice.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's crying out, isn't it? Like context is king. And we've heard that for a long time from employees or our learners, that they want relevance as you know, that's the kind of key trend. But actually we're in a really position to be able to deliver on that much more, and we will do in the future as well. So I think that's why we're also seeing the return of the blend. You know, this kind of the smart use of technology can really be at our fingertips. And over time starting to use AI to play roles in that, such as being coaches or providing prompts into live discussions, for example. Okay, great. I'm going to move on because I think it's just good to reflect back that rather than just getting caught up in the shiny new trends, but actually thinking about what they're telling us about what learners need. So let's have a little look about how we think you can create engaging digital learning, and we're going to open the floor up and get your ideas too. So we'll talk about relevance as being one of the key staples in engagement trends or engagement needs. So what are your ideas for helping ensure that learning experiences and resources are relevant? So if you can use the chat, we'll open up the floor to you, and then we'll talk about some of our ideas. I'm just having a look what's in here already. So it's been busy in the chat already. Yeah, great. So relevance is at time of need, so something we've talked about there. So I need this now. Using your SMEs and observing people on the job. Yeah, that's a great way to get close to what people actually need, which is part of the practice here.
Yeah, and that's something that's, you know, really missing from a lot of that kind of needs analysis for learning programs, is getting really close to the end users and really understanding their pains and their challenges so that the learning can be driven by that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so a good understanding of what people need is coming through, yeah, loud and clear, which is great.
Yeah. And Laura's just said ask them, which is a very simple way of distilling down that message. Yeah, it's such an obvious thing, but it's a step that's often missed. Yeah,
it's really easy to miss it on the kind of smaller projects, which is why we kind of put together our capture guides to kind of make that an easy step. But yeah, sometimes we only think about it on those big programs, but we can also do it in a kind of micro way as well. Okay, brilliant. So yeah, focus groups, pilot sessions are kind of an extension of that if you want to get more in depth with your user feedback. But there's some key themes coming through, so that's great. So let's talk about some ideas here. So in lots of our Design Tip Tuesdays, we open up pieces of digital learning and kind of walk you through them and show you them. Today, we're going to just give you a high-level view, and if anyone wants to go and look at the projects afterwards, they're all available on the Elucidat showcase, and we can point you to them. So some really simple ways to make your content relevant. One is to provide a role or team selector up front. So that's probably something you've used before. If not, it's a really simple device. You select where you work or what you do in your role, and then you can filter the content from there. So behind the scenes, you can have created branches to serve up the right content in the right context for that role. Diagnostics is not a new thing, but it's sometimes forgotten in terms of its power to provide relevant learning to people. So by asking some questions up front, which can be around your competency, your confidence, or a bit of a mixture in both of those. Or you could test somebody out in a kind of scenario, for example. Then depending on how they do, you can provide the right kind of learning for them. They might not need anything else. So it's a great thing that's done often in compliance, for example. So why go over the old compliance theory if somebody can prove that they already know it? And then personalized content, which we'll talk about in a moment, and I'll show you some ideas. There's lots of different ways to personalize the content, which I'll bring up now, actually. So I'm sure you all have different techniques to create personalized learning. I'll ask you in a minute, or you can start putting your ideas in the chat already. But a classic way to personalize learning content or digital learning content is through the use of scenarios. And why is that personalized? Because I'm making choices, and as a result of the choices I make, I then receive a different next step to someone else. So it could be a different part of the story is revealed to me, a different outcome in the story, or I might get pointed to some resources that I really need to go and have a look at. So I'm part of it, I'm interacting, and it's an experience that I'm in. So that's personalized by its very nature. Really simple one is also giving people choice. So we sometimes forget this. Most of our learners are adults, and very, very clear signposting, really clear menus means that you can give people choice as to what they go and find out about. So it's really great for people who are in that kind of point of need when they know what they want, they just need to be able to get it. But then you can kind of really well package up the kind of results for that. So you can see a kind of little example here on the slide of how you might kind of pull together some signposted resources to help somebody in that situation. And then personalised plans, which we have a few of on our showcase. These are kind of more personalised by the very nature compared with just giving someone choice up front. Because what they do is they use a mixture of, well, in Elucidat, they use a mixture of something called rules, which allows you to create branches of content, but also clips. So based on the answers that somebody gives to questions, which could be a mixture of open input or select from choice or multiple choice, then it kind of replays back the answers that you've given and then gives you some tips as a result. So you get a very personalized plan at the end of the learning, for example, that gives you the calls to action that you need to go and do. So based on your understanding, what you said you need, your opinion on this, and the role that you play, here's what you need to go and do. So it's kind of a very holistic, very personalized approach to learning, of which there's lots of examples on our showcase. But what about you? Have you got other ways in which you might be personalizing your e-learning? Or perhaps you're looking outside of the e-learning to do this by pointing people towards mentoring sessions, for example. Anyone got thoughts on that?
There's been a couple of good points around how some of the kind of preparation work you can do in order to kind of generate learning design approaches that will facilitate that personalization. And I think, we've already spoken before about kind of just going and talking to learners, but I think thinking about kind of what different roles require, so you can do it by different roles, or you can do it by kind of business units or teams, whatever it might be. But really understanding that kind of almost that taxonomy of your audience and the different segments of your audience is going to enable you to then understand what level of personalization you need, because it does take time, it does take effort. So you really want to understand the scope of it before you start, to make sure that you're investing that time and effort in a way that's going to kind of have maximum impact.
That makes sense, yeah. And I think that is the classic way to kind of use AI as well here, so that if you've got some personas, some information about your kinds of users that you're doing your learning for, and you know what the learning subject is, then you can work with AI to, if you're allowed to, of course, to kind of, you can create some core content for a core role and then ask it to match the content and context and activities for the other personas that you can feed it. Obviously, then you need to check what it's done. But yeah, that's a classic way to kind of use AI to extend what you do in your learning and to make it personalized.
Yeah, Kristen's just made a good point around kind of creating personalized pathways. So using virtual classrooms after participating in an Elucidat module. So you have that kind of core content in the module, and then you can break out into smaller, more specific groups.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to move on then for us to talk about blends in a second, but before I do, I'm just going to flash up some further ideas about interactivity. Obviously, Will's talked to you about this a lot and you've already chipped in. But again, we see scenarios, so branching scenarios or case studies that you can get involved with and make decisions around. Interactive stories, again, we have some of these on our showcase where you start to be pulled into making decisions within that story and just simply getting people thinking. So asking questions, they can be rhetorical. You don't always have to get the click on the page, but getting people to think, getting people to consider what they need or what their opinion is. And of course, using things like social polls to compare their opinion with other people's just deepens that thinking. So those are some ideas for interactivity there. I want to get us to think about blends. Particularly, we've got 5 minutes left in the webinar, so I think this is a great area to kind of dive into and get your thoughts. So I'd like us all to imagine that we want to create some training around communication skills. Just think broadly for now. And we have some fantastic central videos that we could use, some really good storytelling that we could use around this. And what would you put around the edges to make it a more holistic experience, do you think? It doesn't all have to be e-learning. So I want you to think kind of broadly about what sort of things you could put in the mix of a blend to create some effective learning around communication skills. Some of which, so hint, we've already talked about virtual classrooms. So there could be some needs there that come out. Anyone got any thoughts about how to extend a blend? Will, have you got any thoughts over there?
Yeah, I was just looking at the chat. Maybe blended isn't quite so much of a priority for people. And I think, like you said, post-COVID, obviously everything went online, and we're seeing a bit of a kind of slow but gradual migration back. But Laura's just called out kind of prompting questions and also like a virtual coach. So I think we mentioned earlier how you can weave virtual coaches into that mix. Kind of reflections after videos.
I like that idea. Yeah, reflection boxes. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
What the learner took away. Yeah.
Yeah, it's perfect. Getting people to really kind of think about what they've seen and connect it with their own experience as well. Diagnostic questions about confidence or experience in communication, because then you can segment your learners based on those inputs, which is fantastic.
Yeah, okay, great. Keep it coming because they're all fantastic and we can always use them and share some tips afterwards as well. Some really quick ideas are that, for example, using Slack messages, or you might use Microsoft Teams or something, but where people are working, use some teasers, put out some short clips to get people interested, bring them into your e-learning, which hopefully would be within Elucidat. You can have your interactive micro-learning with a kind of story in there, for example, and then you could follow that up with a book club style discussion, something virtual, something in person, quite informal. Maybe get people to answer a poll and then bring them back in for the next instalment. And this time you could get them more involved with where the story goes by making it a kind of branching scenario, for example. So there's different ways that you can kind of use a mixture of virtual or in-person alongside e-learning, but also thinking about other areas where people are working, where you can kind of put out key messages and bring people into the experience. It's a very, very quick blast through some ideas on blended, but hopefully it gives you a flavour of where we could take things in the future. So let's do a bit of wrapping up in the last couple of minutes, Will. I'm going to pass back to you. So let's pull up this whole slide here and maybe you can
Yeah,
talk.
so just like a really quick summary, I think the key thing that I took away from the insights from the State of Digital Learning report was that engagement is as important as ever, and some of the tried and tested methods of achieving that are still kind of totally relevant, still totally effective. So as Kirstie said, you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can still kind of lean on these old techniques whilst looking to the future and looking at new ways of doing things as well. Blended and hybrid solutions are making a bit of a comeback, which is fantastic because it gives you kind of more scope for your design approaches, more interesting ways of delivering great content to your learners. And then just a bit of a shameless plug for our next session in March, using data to inform your decisions about how you're kind of curating these blends. We've got a session coming up on that next month, so please all sign up for that. We're working all along to that. And then finally, just the point about kind of immersive tech and AI, it's here, it's a reality. A lot of people are using it, but I think we're still at the very beginning of that curve of adoption. So it's only going to get bigger. But I think what we're trying to think about is kind of how can we use it to drive really smart approaches. So not just using it for the sake of it and thinking that everything that came before is no longer relevant, but how can we weave it into our workflows and processes now and just use it to create a better experience for learners.
Brilliant. So we're coming up to time, but whilst we finish up, you might want to answer this question in the chat. So do share your actionable takeaways if you've had some from today's session, or you can drop us a line afterwards in an email to kind of share those with us as well. Before we wrap up, Will, do you want to mention what your learning consultancy team does at Elucidat? Because not everybody is aware that it exists.
Yeah, of course. So kind of teased it at the beginning a little bit, but just to say that if you are wanting support with making your projects more interactive and engaging, that is what my team does day in and day out. It's what we're kind of really passionate about. Whether that's a little bit of coaching and enablement for your team, reviewing work in progress, or actually partnering with you on full design and builds, we're here to help you. So if you have any flagship projects that you'd like our support on, please just get in touch.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we'll wrap up there, but this is flash up what's coming next. So you will get a follow-up email, as usual, with the recording in it. And if you haven't read the State of Digital Learning report as yet, we'll put a link into that and join us for our next session. So the sign-up page has them all on there. Thanks for all your contributions, much appreciated, and we shall see you soon.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.